The beer mug shattered against the wooden floor with a violent crack that silenced Murphy's roadhouse instantly, and the sound still hung in the air when Viper Jackson's voice cut through the sudden quiet like a blade his massive hand wrapped around the collar of the small woman, who had been wiping down tables, and the snake tattoo coiling around his thick neck seemed to writhe as he pulled her close to his breath, reeking of whiskey and menace, as he snarled that he had. Asked a simple question. Sweetheart, whether this bar paid protection or whether this bar burned, and which one was going to be, and Elena Rodriguez kept her brown eyes fixed on the floor, her body language screaming submission, even as 10 members of the Desert Vipers motorcycle club rose from their seats, forming a predatory circle around her, and she stood barely 5'4", in her worn sneakers, her white server's shirt hanging loose on her slight frame, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look even younger than her 35 years, and everything about her whispered ordinary, forgettable week. Yet in exactly 15 minutes, Viper Jackson would be on his knees begging for forgiveness. And while the tension had been brewing inside Murphy's roadhouse for 20 minutes before that glass shattered, it reached its peak as the Desert Vipers rolled in just after 8, their Harleys announcing their arrival with a thunderous roar that made every patron tense, because this was not their first visit to establishments along the highway near Camp Pendleton, and their reputation preceded them like a dark cloud, as 3 bars in the past month had mysteriously caught fire after refusing their protection services, and 2 owners had ended up in a hospital with injuries they dared not attribute to anything but accidents, and Elena had watched them enter while folding napkins with precise military neatness or movements, economical and controlled, while Jake, the young bartender, immediately began sweating at the sight of skull patches on their leather vests, whispering in panic that these were the same men who had burned down Rossetti's place in Oceanside. But Elena had only nodded, continuing her folding in perfect triangles, because Jake had already noticed in 6 months of working with her that everything about her carried a strange, almost military precision, from the way she wiped tables in grid patterns to how she never allowed her back to face the door for more than a few seconds. And when Viper made his entrance like a conquering king, 6'3", swaggering with arms spread wide as snake tattoo starting at his jaw and disappearing into his vest, while his companions, fanned out behind him with tactical awareness, Elena had quietly noted their dispersal, covering exits, maintaining sight lines, and establishing dominance, while the regular patrons, many of them veterans, shifted uneasily, and Sheriff Tom Bradley, a grizzled Iraq veteran, set down his coffee hand, drifting instinctively toward the sidearm he would have carried if he had been on duty, and Elena had stepped forward to serve them, keeping her eyes low and her voice soft, even as one of the bikers slapped her as she passed, and she moved away without acknowledgement, preventing Jake from charging in with a subtle shake of her head while serving their beers quietly until Viper's attention fixed on her, and he demanded to know where Murphy was. And when she told him he was away in Phoenix, Viper declared she would have to pass a message and announce their protection fee of $5,000 a month, with the promise that accidents happened to those who refused, and Elena continued to clean her already spotless table, answering calmly that she would let him know, but his patience thinned as he clicked his lighter open and closed, warning her that this was not a social call, but a requirement. And while his men unconsciously formed a circle around her, Elena had already cataloged their weaknesses: the limp of the one near the jukebox, the inattentiveness of the 2 near the pool table, the oversight of Sheriff Bradley shifting for a defensive position, and Viper himself standing far too close inside the reactionary gap, and her hand brushed the dog tag hidden beneath her shirt, the metal warm against her chest, a reminder of who she had been and who she was trying not to be anymore. 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, 15 confirmed kills, multiple Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart, all locked away with her uniform while she sought peace and obscurity. Yet trouble always found Marines, even those who tried to vanish into civilian life. And though her reinforced military-grade phone rested in her pocket, capable of summoning backup, she had sworn not to use those contacts again. So she stood there calm as Viper offered her bribes and promises of protection if she persuaded Murphy to comply. And when she finally looked into his eyes, her calm serenity infuriated him until he seized her arm hard enough to bruise, and that was when Sheriff Bradley rose, telling him firmly to let the lady go, and Viper laughed, dismissing him as an old man outnumbered 10-1. But other patrons, many of them wearing unit pins or tattoos of their own, shifted ready to stand beside the sheriff, and the air grew thick with the promise of violence, until Elena softly addressed the sheriff by name, telling him it was all right, that these gentlemen were just leaving, and it was. Then that Viper made his fatal mistake, yanking her closer, reaching for a collar, and declaring that they would leave when they were good and ready, and that right now he thought a lesson was needed. The whole bar seemed to hold its breath as Viper Jackson snarled that he was going to teach the whole place a lesson about respect, and the scrape of chairs echoed against the wooden floor as more patrons rose to their feet, ready to intervene, while Jake gripped the baseball bat kept behind the counter, his knuckles white, but Viper's gaze never wavered. From Elena, intent on breaking what he thought was undeserved resistance from someone he believed should have been trembling in submission, and his words dripped with venom as he leaned close, declaring that her problem was she thought she was better than them, too good to show proper respect, and maybe she needed to be reminded of her place. And as he bunched the fabric of her shirt, his fist, Elena stood perfectly still, her eyes steady, her breathing calm, her body appearing to every ordinary onlooker like that of a terrified waitress frozen in fear. Yet Sheriff Bradley saw what others missed: the subtle adjustment of her weight to the balls of her feet, the calculated position of her hands, the deliberate angle of her body that created just enough room for movement, the marks of a soldier preparing for action. And Viper snarled again, giving her one last chance to call Murphy and agree to a new partnership, or else everyone in the room would suffer the consequences. But Elena's reply was simple and firm. She said she could not do that. And then came the sound of tearing cloth, final and raw, as Viper yanked with brute strength, ripping her shirt wide open from collar, chest leaving to hang in tatters, and exposing the black tank top beneath. And in that instant the atmosphere shifted completely, for through the thin fabric on her back the entire bar saw what she had never meant to reveal: an emblem wrought in ink and scar tissue that carried more authority than any weapon. The eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps stretched with perfect detail across her shoulders, its artistry so fine that even the feathers of the eagle seemed to carry weight, and beneath it in bold block letters were the words "First Force Recon," a name that needed no explanation for anyone who had ever worn a uniform for it, mark her as one of the rare few who had gone where others feared to tread. And further down was her designation: Gunny E. Rodriguez 0311, the code that defined her as infantry, the very tip of the spear. And as the eyes of the room traced the tattoo, they also fell upon the stories carved into her flesh: a puckered bullet wound near her shoulder, the ragged kisses of shrapnel along her ribs, a long blade scar disappearing beneath the hem of her tank top. And these marks spoke more clearly than any words ever could. The room fell into absolute silence, even the jukebox pausing, as though the world itself recognized a moment. And Viper Jackson stood frozen, his hand still clutching her torn shirt, his mouth slightly open, as though his brain refused to process what his eyes told him, and his men, the desert vipers who moments ago had been brimming with predatory confidence, now faltered visibly, their bravado draining away like water from a shattered vessel. And then Sheriff Bradley breathed the words that broke the silence: Force Recon, his voice reverent and filled with all holy hell. He muttered, and in that instant Elena changed, not by motion or pose, for she had not taken a stance or raised a hand, but by presence itself, her shoulders squaring subtly, her head tilting in the calm poise of a warrior who had once commanded men in fire and chaos, the fearsome quiet of someone who had stared death in the eye and walked away. Elena squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, and when she finally spoke, her voice had shed the soft, submissive quality she had carried all evening. And what came out instead was a steady tone of command, as she addressed him not as Viper, but as Mr. Jackson, calling him by his real name, which he had not expected her to know. And she told him plainly that he owed her an apology for destroying her property. And the room shifted as though the very air had changed before Storm's expression twisted through confusion, disbelief, and the sinking realization that he had made a catastrophic error. And the torn shirt slipped from his hand, drifting to the floor like a white flag of surrender. His voice faltered as he asked how she knew his name, but Elena ignored the question, turning slowly, so every eye could see the ink and scars that marked her back, and people began raising their phones, recording instinctively, knowing they were witnessing something unforgettable. And when she finally spoke again, she did not just speak his name, but his record. She recited it clearly: Stephen Jackson, dishonorably discharged for theft and black market sales, now wanted in multiple cases of arson and assault. The weight of her knowledge pressing on him heavier than any fist. And then from the corner booth, Colonel Mike Harrison stood, his gravel voice slicing through the silence as he addressed her as Gunny Rodriguez and recalled her presence in Fallujah in 2004, his recognition sparking a chain of memory and respect that rippled through the room. And Elena answered him as a Marine to a superior officer, giving names of men who had not survived with the kind of reverence that only the fallen earn. And then Maria Santos, the quiet florist, rose and revealed her own history as a Navy corpsman, remembering the day they brought Elena in broken and burned with doctor swearing. She would never walk again, and Elena answered simply that doctors can be wrong, and in that moment the bikers, who once filled the room with menace, began edging toward the door, only to find it blocked by men who carried themselves not as civilians, but as veterans, each one standing like a wall. And when one of them reminded Viper that he had yet to apologize, the gang leader, flushed with humiliation as authority, unraveling before everyone, and Elena stepped forward, her presence forcing him back despite his size, and she demanded to know whether he thought respect was only owed when strength could be proven, whether he believed she needed to advertise that she had bled for this country and earned dignity. And her calm words struck harder than any blow, and when she commanded him to kneel, her voice cut through him like a blade of command honed by war. And he dropped without thought to his knees before stammering out his apology, while the bar watched in awed silence. And when she accepted it, he stumbled his feet, his men falling in line behind him like whipped dogs. And as they reached the door, he turned back to ask why she hid what she was, why she pretended to be only a server. And Elena's eyes softened as she told him that real warriors did not need to announce themselves, that true strength was carried quietly and used only when necessary, and that she had come here searching for peace only to have him force her hand. And as they left on their motorcycles, stripped of their swagger, every patron knew they would not return. And in the heavy silence that followed, Colonel Harrison asked her why she was here wasting her skills when she could have taken any path of honor and power, and Elena folded the ruined shirt with the same careful precision she had given napkins, and answered with steady voice that she had already been extraordinary, that she had already been the tip of the spear with medals and kills and scars enough to last a lifetime, and that what she wanted now was ordinary to pour coffee, without pity in people's eyes. But as she slipped into a clean Murphy's shirt, she told him all that the Vipers had reminded her of a truth she had almost forgotten, that peace is never found by hiding, but only by standing one's ground. And the room, which had been held captive in silence, now released a breath, as if the entire bar had just been taught a lesson about what true respect really means. Jake finally found his voice and stammered out that he had no idea who she really was after 6 months of working together, and Elena smiled at him for the first time, a real smile that softened the steel in her face, and told him that was the point, because she had not wanted to be Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, Force Recon Marine. She had wanted to be Elena, the woman who made sure his coffee stayed hot and the table stayed clean. But when someone called her a hero from the back of the room, her expression hardened, and she corrected them, saying that Williams and Chun were the heroes because they had died protecting civilians, while she had only been too stubborn to die and too broken to do anything but survive. And then Colonel Harrison approached, carefully addressing her with respect and reminding her of what she had done in Fallujah, holding that position to protect the children, and that Williams and Chun had not died in vain, because 37 children had made it out because of what the 3 of them had done. But Elena quietly corrected him and said 38 because one more had been born in the evac chopper, and her mother had named her Elena. And the room fell into reverent silence as the weight of her words settled over them all. And when Jake asked what she would do now that everyone knew her identity, she simply resumed her duties, wiping tables and collecting glasses, as if nothing had changed, saying that she would just have to be visible, but on her terms. And slowly the bar returned to normal, though not quite the same, because there was a new energy as conversations sparked. Veterans opened up about their struggles, and the weight of shared silence lifted, and Sheriff Bradley later approached to apologize for not stepping in sooner, and she told him he had nothing to apologize for, because